Hey everyone, welcome to Making of a Cover number 4. This one's all about the sounds that I used for my cover of Blade Runner Blues. So if you haven't seen that yet, you might want to check it out. People tend to wonder what's live and what's overdubbed, and so as a comparison, what I was just playing around with was all live, and on the other cover, I do some overdubbing of bass and strings so that I can do a better job with those. On the strings, I really wanted to just sort of hit the strings, hold them with a sustain pedal like I was just doing. And unfortunately, you see me using this thing. This is called a key dog. You can buy these. Most people wouldn't want one, but this is the kind of thing that Vangelis used to use both with the Hammond and with the VP330 to hold down keys because they didn't have sustain pedals. Surprisingly, this Behringer doesn't have the ability to do sustain. So you can't, even with MIDI, you can't control the sustain. So what I was just playing was a combination of the Hydrasynth and the other Rev 2 unit, and then I was holding down one note on here. So I'm going to talk a little bit later about how to get a string machine sound out of a Hydrasynth. I'm going to talk a little bit about bass, just a touch, but mostly I'm going to talk about this beautiful and sort of mysterious lead sound. How do you get a lead sound like this? This was something, this cover took me probably longer than any other cover that I've done, partly because it's a long piece and Vangelis was not repeating himself, so it's he goes from one beautiful line to another, and so it's a lot to get your head around. But also, I spent more time probably with this patch than any other patch, and I I knew this was going to be a struggle because I had played around with it a little bit in the past, and also over the years I purchased sounds from other people, and so I had something like 6 other versions of this patch for different instruments that were programmed by different people. And when you line up those 6, you notice that they're all different, and none of them sound really just like the original. And I don't want anyone to misconstrue what I'm saying. These other programmers are, for the most part, much better than I am. They know more things than I do about programming, some of whom I really respect a lot. But there's something about that sound that's really hard to get. It's not intuitive for most of us. And so I was getting stuck, and the way I work is that I always do the sounds first, and I do that for 2 reasons. One, I enjoy programming, and I especially enjoy programming more than I enjoy what comes next, which is the tedious process of figuring out all the notes. But also, it's like if I can't get the sounds right, then I'm not going to do the cover. And I was starting to wonder if I was going to be able to do this cover because I just wasn't getting that lead sound. And fortunately, I reached out to Jose Evers. And I asked him, did you ever try to do this? And do you have any suggestions? And fortunately, he really came through with a great suggestion that got me unstuck. Now, 3 months later, I was still making adjustments to this patch. It took a while, but he really got me unstuck. And I probably should have dedicated the video to him because I probably wouldn't have been able to do it otherwise. So, and if you don't know Jose's channel, it's called Jose's Vintage Keys. And he's done an exceptional job at acquiring, maintaining, and managing to hang on to a lot of these vintage instruments that we all love so much. So he has a Yamaha CS-80, a VP330, a Fender Rhodes piano, a Mini Moog. He has a vintage Oberheim. It makes for a wonderful channel because he has knowledge of all these instruments, and he's a great person too. So I'm sure some of you already have checked out his channel. So what he said was, don't forget about the CS-80 sine wave. It can be used to thicken up an otherwise rather thin sound. He said something like that. And that was like, oh, okay, yeah. Now, if you really want to nail this sound, it helps to remember how a CS-80 is sort of laid out. And I mentioned in one of my earlier videos, I think it was the last one of these, I said something wrong, which is I said that it's 2 single oscillator consoles in a CS-80. And that was true of the sound I was talking about, but a CS-80 has more than one oscillator in each manual. So each one has a sawtooth. They start with a pulse width, then a sawtooth, and you can use those two together, which is unusual. Then there's a noise generator, and then there's a resonant high-pass filter, a resonant low-pass filter, and then you come to the rather unconventional envelope generator of the CS-80. And one of the things that makes it unique is that there's no sustain on it. So when that filter is opening to the brightest pitch, it hits that brightest point and then it starts to drop. And it never hits a sustain where it holds, it just keeps dropping. So that's worth knowing. You get through that whole filter section, and then at the end, there's a sine wave. And now some of you are maybe scratching your head thinking, well, why would you put an oscillator of any kind at the end of the filter section? And others of you might be smiling and saying, well, because a sine wave is just the fundamental. There's no other frequencies to filter out. So when you have a high-pass filter and a low-pass filter and you're using both of them a lot, you're going to get, it's like a bandpass filter, and you're going to get something very thin. And then at the end, you can add this rather loud sine wave in to thicken up the sound. And that to me is the key to this sound that most people are missing. Now, how do you get a sine wave on a Rev 2? Because it doesn't have a sine wave. So the first thing I did, and by the way, some of you are saying, well, gosh, you have a Hydrasynth, why don't you just do it on there? Well, I had a friendly competition between these two instruments. They both wanted to play the lead sound, and so they were both competing to see which would get the best version of it. So I kept, for quite a while, it seemed like the Hydrasynth was going to win, because over there it's easy to get a sine wave. There's a high-pass filter, a low-pass filter. It's laid out very much like it. But at some point, the Rev 2 caught up and greatly surpassed it. The analog character really, I think, won out. Also, I did a lot of comparisons with the Cherry Audio GX80 and comparing that to both of these instruments. And I don't know, hopefully Jose will do a comparison for us at some point with a real CS-80. But the Rev 2 is much closer as far as the overall sound. On the Hydrasynth, it's kind of similar up top and down below, and somewhere in the middle it's not as bright, I found. So anyway, on here I started with a square wave and I rolled off all the highs, and that sounded immediately a lot better than what I had before. But down below it was not quite as good. And then at some point I realized, and I don't know if I should have known this, but if you use a 2-pole filter, I think it's that it's self-resonating, although maybe it's a different reason. But if you take the 2-pole and you turn off the filter, and then you take the envelope amount of the filter, put that right in the middle at 0, crank the resonance all the way up to max, you get a nice sine wave. And it works all the way down as low as you want it to. And when you blend that in with the rest of the sound, now you get something that has that character that I was not hearing before. Now, what's the rest of it? Well, a lot of you probably have better ears than I do, so you might disagree with me. But I spent a lot of time kind of experimenting, trying to get the right amount of like the sizzle that you have up there, but not too much. And so you can tell me if I went too far or not enough. So how do you get that high, thin, sizzling sound? I eventually came to think that it was a combination of a sawtooth and an extremely thin pulse width with pulse width modulation on it, and that they're both then going through a high-pass filter and then through the low-pass filter, and then combined with a sine wave. So the way that sounds, now again on here you're like, well, that's easy if you have a Hydrasynth, but how do you do it on a Rev 2? Fortunately, Dave Smith put one of the effects as a high-pass filter. So that's not ideal, but I experimented with it enough that I found a way to get it to do what I wanted it to do. So if you put the high-pass filter effect on, take the amount of the mix all the way up to max, take the resonance and turn that off, and then take the cutoff amount up to 155. That's where I set it. It gives me what I wanted. So with the pulse is all the way down at like 0, and then there's pulse width modulation on it. So it's like a bug in your ear sound. And then the sawtooth going through the same, and the resonance of the low pass filter is around 30, and there with the saw it's like. Then I blend those two together. I want to give it more pulse because that's quieter, so I'm going to give it more of that. And now the pulse width modulation with the sawtooth is going to give it some nice movement. And now you add in that rather robust, which I'm putting the sine wave on the lower level. And then, of course, there's all kinds of things that you can do that everybody else does with Aftertouch. Over here, again, some Hydrasynth tips for getting strings. So if I turn off the Rev 2, I leave the Behringer off completely. This is just Hydrasynth. Hopefully that's loud enough. Over here, oh, surprisingly, if you've watched my other videos, you know I like to combine two Rev 2s together to get a nice stereo field, and that's almost always an improvement on the sound. I was really surprised that with this lead sound, I ended up using just one instrument. When I added the other one, somehow it lost something. So whether you want to have it right down the middle of the stereo mix, or if they were playing off each other in a weird way, somehow it didn't work very well, which surprised me. Over here, I was really surprised that all the little tricks that I like to use to warm up the Hydrasynth didn't help. So again, if you've watched my other making of a cover videos, you know that I like creative spirals, voice component modulation templates, and I use those on both of these all the time. This was one of the first sounds I've ever done on the Hydrasynth where I didn't like that. I turned that all the way off. I turned off the vintage warmth, the all that kind of, those little tricks that you use to kind of make it sound more analog, all that was off. And then I took just saw waves, and resonance was around 28. And the main thing that gave me the sound was wave stack. So one of the mutants, I went to wave stack. I made wave stack around in the mid 80s, and it was slightly different on each side. And then I put the wet dry amount to about 69, I think it was. And that's a lot of the sound. Now there's also, on this I noticed there's this a little, like if you let a note play, there's a little pitch glitch. I don't know if you're hearing that, but it's like it plays and then it's like a little hiccup. And so I used one of the extra envelope generators to add some of that into that. Over here, again, I'm using the regular, one of the Montage's many great Fender Rhodes pianos, and I have that from the top down to in here somewhere. And then, as I've done in some other videos, I used their CS-80 mellow bass. This was a free upgrade you could get as a pack. and it's the only one of those sounds that I really love and use a lot of. But I think it's great. And Vangelis was, for the bass, he was overdubbing that. By the way, in analyzing these pieces, when you play them slowly and you really listen to them a lot, you notice that there's a tremendous amount of overdubbing going on. And he was doing this at Nemo Studios. It was the only way that they could do things. And they would overdub single lines. They would overdub the strings a lot. And then all these Fender Rhodes parts, they're mixed in. And there's all these layers. And I notice that they're not lining up very surgically. And so it's like the string changes, then you hear the bass, then you hear the lead, and everything has this looseness to it. And I really think that's a lot of what we like. It's what our ears like about the Nemo Studios period. Later, when he got MIDI and everything, you could hit a note and it'll play, 50 different sample machines, but it's all very surgical and everything is very neat. I think maybe we like that looser feel. Just an observation. Anyway, on the bass, he was using the ribbon controller to vary the pitch, and so like he'd hit a note and then it would pitch up and down, bending up and down. And I wanted to do that with one hand. There is a ribbon controller on the Montage, but so I did it with aftertouch. So it's like this. And that's kind of fun. I never did that before, and thought I'd share that as well. That's a lot of what I wanted to talk about. Thanks for hanging in there. And if you like my covers, the thing you can do to help the most is make comments. Having a YouTube channel is a kind of it's a lonely thing that you do, and sometimes you're kind of like, why am I doing this? And gosh, this is taking a long time. And then I get a comment from somebody, and it really brightens up my day and keeps me motivated. And also, when you make comments, it seems like, I mean, even if they're bad comments, then YouTube will put the video in front of more people. So if you like my stuff, consider doing that. Thanks so much.